Welcome to the Empathy Table, an Ideos Institute podcast. At Ideos, we are all about ideas, in particular, how empathy shapes and influences the ideas for solving some of our world's greatest challenges. But there is something interesting about both ideas and empathy. They usually begin with a story, and some of the best stories are often shared around a table. In light of COVID-19 and its considerable impact around the world, we are bringing you Food for Thought, a special edition of the Empathy Table.
Food for Thought is a place to share stories of nourishment that inspire leaders to lead and individuals to live with empathy in uncertain times. The COVID-19 outbreak has shaken all of us, spreading fear and panic faster than the virus itself. Rather than despair the uncertainty ahead of us, we at Ideos see a better way forward. There is a table set before us that demands and offers something to body and soul alike. Should we decline this invitation, we continue down a path towards chaos and tribalism. But, should we partake, we pave the way for a future entirely different from our past, becoming more human in the process. So join us this season on the Empathy Table as we step boldly into an uncertain new world. We have prepared a seat. Will you join us? This morning, we have joining us Ideos President Christy Vines. Good morning, Christy. How are you doing?
Good morning, Alyssa. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are things in the COVID-19 era going for you?
It's going well. You know, I'm an introvert by nature, so being inside is in some ways not a huge jarring reality for me. Also allowing me to, I think, be a little bit more intentional about my area, my focus, but also learning to be gentle with myself and giving my permission to kind of adapt to these new rhythms that we're all experiencing.
Yeah, it's definitely been a period of adjustment, but it is nice to have a little bit more space.
Yes.
In the day. Yeah.
Yes. Although I look forward to the time when we're all back together again.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, it's good to have you here this morning. Can you tell us more about what the Empathy Table is?
Yes. So the Empathy Table is really meant to be an opportunity for dialogue. It's a platform for dialogue, in particular around issues that we tend to have a challenging time having a conversation about. So it's, I guess, a little bit of a response to what people often say are the things you don't talk about, religion and politics. Well, the things that we actually really enjoy talking about in addition to many other topics. And so often we have these kinds of conversations around tables, around dinner tables, around conference tables, around picnic tables. It's usually a table where we have those kinds of conversations. And often those same tables are the places we find the safest. So a table with our family, a table with our friends. It's really an invitation to share not just your perspective, but your stories. And so the Empathy Table is really a place for the sharing of stories, and in particular, stories that have to do with a really challenging, polarizing kind of topic. And so that's really what the Empathy Table is about. It's the sharing of stories around polarizing and challenging issues as an opportunity to help move us more closely towards solutions.
Yeah. And whose stories are we sharing?
Well, in general, we're sharing the stories of everyone, whether it's the expert or thought leader, or the politician. But we really are trying to emphasize the stories of those closest to and most impacted by the issue itself. And so, it's the person who's living, breathing, experiencing those issues every day. So whether it's border issues and immigration, and so we're talking about people on both sides of the border who themselves are experiencing that issue in a very unique and different way. Well, their stories are going to be different, but their stories matter. And so we really are trying to expose those perspectives and those stories to audiences who often only hear the stories of the experts. And so we believe that those are the experts. And in this era, we're actually doing a special edition called Food for Thought. And it really is to invite people to talk about what a future future post COVID-19 will look like, and how, especially those of us in the church, those of us who call ourselves Christ followers, how we're seeding that future, how we're preparing for that future, and those of us who want to co-create that future, how we can do that together.
Wow, that's really beautiful. So why choose the podcast format?
So we're choosing a podcast format first and foremost because it's accessible. It's accessible to everyone. Anyone can sign up for a podcast feed. And to be honest, most of us are listening to podcasts anyways. And so it was a way of finding a platform that allowed for easy distribution and accessibility to anyone. It also is a natural format because it's conversational in nature. It is in some ways much more intimate than really almost any other platform outside of video, which is also why we've chosen to make this a video podcast, because we think having the ability to actually see the faces, expressions of those and emotions of those who are sharing their stories is really important, and really in and of itself lends itself well to empathy. So that's really why we've made that decision. The other thing was the empathy table was actually intended to be an environment where those people who are sharing their stories are sitting around an actual physical table. Because we can't do that right now. It just made sense to utilize the podcasting platform to actually launch the empathy table, Food for Thought.
Yeah. You talk a lot about story and personal connection. What impact do those things have on our ability to empathize?
Great question. I think inherently it's our stories that uniquely connect us as humans. It's really the expression and the language we have to share our experiences with someone who's never walked a mile in our shoes and never experienced a life that we've lived. And so stories also translate across ethnicities, across religions, across genders, across generations. And so because we believe that not only are our stories important and they do overcome those different divides and barriers, they're also something that are uniquely unique to each person. But there's something that absolutely every human on this earth has. And so it's a way that we can relate to one another. It's a way that we connect to one another. It's also the way that we understand more easily somebody who might be very different from ourselves, who might think, feel, or act very differently than we do. Sometimes it's only our stories that allow us to connect and overcome those divides that are often the things that we can see, smell, taste, and feel.
Yeah. And how does that change the way we approach polarizing and divisive issues?
Yeah, great question. In some ways, it changes everything because we're not talking about what is right for us or what we think individually is the correct way forward. Instead, what we're saying is, I have a unique perspective because of the experiences, my background, the lived experiences I have in this life that lend itself to how I think about this issue, how I experience this issue. And oftentimes it's that experience and background that creates the polarization from somebody who's very different. And so stories in and of themselves allow us to connect outside of those differences. But in some ways, they also are such a huge connection, human connection that we have. It's really a language we have that no other living being has. Humans are really the only ones who can share their stories. And I believe that God created that ability, our ability to have language that allows us to share our stories for a purpose. And so because of that, I think it inherently leads towards empathy. My experience has been working in the conflict space for many years, that the stories that people shared with me, strangers who I'd never met before and lands far removed from my own reality, those are the things that stay with me. I remember those stories. I may not remember the work, I may not remember the outcome, but I remember those stories and I remember the people behind those stories. And so for me, it was an instant bond that we share. And I hope that they remember my stories. But it's also the reason why, from an empathic point of view, I think about them and the trauma or the challenges that they experience every day and want to do something about it. And I'm not sure that that would have happened had we not have had the opportunity to share those stories.
Yeah, that's really powerful. It changes the way that you think about conflict and approaching problems.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why do we need the empathy table right now?
Yes, we need it for so many reasons, many of which I'm sure I don't even have to articulate, but I will. Simply the fact that right now our entire experience, politically, socially, and culturally, is defined by polarization. Oftentimes, oftentimes expressed in an us versus them, a right versus wrong, a pick a side kind of a framework. And yet we haven't moved the needle much in terms of actually becoming more connected as a society. I mean, we are more polarized now than at almost any other time in at least modern or recent history, where we aren't even seeing ourselves as Americans through the same lens. And I just believe that because empathy is such a critical component of not just critical thinking, but problem solving, that one of the reasons that we're failing to solve not just our own, familial problems, our own national problems, but our global problems is because empathy is often missing from the equation. And the only way to put it back into the equation is for all of us individually to start to build a little bit of a stronger empathy muscle. And so the empathy table is trying to do that. And since it's about sharing stories, we hope that not only will it build empathy in those who are participating in the empathy table, and even those who are watching or listening to the podcast, but that it's also an opportunity that those who do have that experience can start to spread and share it. And that empathy becomes an almost contagious construct that we get to pass on.
Yeah. What do you think there is to gain when we, and I mean we in the larger societal sense, adopt this contagious empathy?
I think barriers get broken down in a really unique way, and I think a very important way. We can still agree to disagree. I don't think we're ever going to have a kumbaya moment where everybody all of a sudden sees the world the same. And I actually don't wish that to be. I actually think it's important that we all have different ideas, different perspectives, lenses through which we see the world. But I also think that through empathy, it doesn't become a competition for who's right. It becomes a competition for what's best, and best for the collective, for the whole, not just for me. And so I can come to the empathy table, and I can come to empathy with a very distinct and unique and specific perspective. But I also think it's important to be able to attempt to view that same issue through somebody else's lens. I think that then makes us less protective of our own ideas, our own perspectives, a little bit more compassionate about the experiences of others. And I also think it draws us into this conversation about how do we just create a better world together and in a way that benefits more of the whole. And I think that's what we're not doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of times when people think about empathy, they think about losing your own point of view or conceding to another point of view. But it sounds like you're talking about something different. What do you mean when you say empathy?
Yeah, I think so often people think that to be empathetic means that I have to somehow temper my own perspective or my own beliefs or lose some of that. Or as I always say, the expectation is that we all have to moderate somehow, meet in the middle. That's not what empathy is at all. Empathy is, as Brene Brown would say, feeling with someone. I think to feel with someone, you have to, in some ways, understand them a little bit. And I think empathy is that driver. It's that connection. It allows us at least to have a desire to feel with somebody else, even someone we may never know. And I think as human beings, that's a really unique quality that we have. I also think it's what God has invited us into, as residents of this world, as occupants of this world. I think He's called us to relate to one another, not to see who's right, who's wrong, who can come out on top, but rather how we can co-create together. I mean, that's really what we're here for, is to co-create. But if we're battling over every difference, and that becomes a wall between us and somebody else who needs a solution, then we never move forward. We never advance, and we certainly never grow as a society. And I think right now that growth is integral to a flourishing community and a flourishing world.
Yeah. So you talk about Brene Brown's concept of feeling with and then also moving forward. And actually, another podcast I was listening to recently said, if you're not hurting, you're not leading. And I think something that I've run into is empathy fatigue. And when you let these stories in, it takes a toll emotionally. So this is kind of a two-part question. How are you hurting, or what ways are we collectively hurting, and how do we move forward? How do we lead into a new reality, a new future?
Yeah, I love this idea of, if you're not hurting, you're not leading. I also think if you're not hurting, you're not creating. And I think in large part, this idea of a collective pain that we're experiencing is evident in our world. I think the simple fact is, not only do we not know the people around us in our community, we often don't know our own neighbors. And part of that is this ability that we have. Technology is this incredibly powerful tool, and in large part, it's connected us in ways that wouldn't have been even conceivable a few generations ago, that you could actually be in immediate connection with somebody on the other side of the world. And so I love that technology has allowed us to do that, but it's also allowed us, through algorithms and search engines, allowed us to self-select who we believe our neighbor is, who we identify with, and then how we choose who to be in community with, who to be in conversation with. And I think in some ways we now have this ability to decide who our neighbor is. Whereas previously it was a physical geographical construct. It was the person living to either side of you. It was the people living in your community, the people that you saw and communed with every day. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. And so we go back into our homes, we go back into our phones, we get on our technology platforms. We get to weed out the people that we decide don't deserve to be our neighbors and select who we want to let in. But that also creates an incredible bias black hole where we are consumed by and affirmed by the biases we hold, because we're selecting and bringing into our community the people who are most like us. We don't get challenged often. And in some ways, stories are an incredible tool to challenge the way you just automatically see the world, to challenge this biased lens that we all hold. And when I say biased lens, so often there's a negative connotation to that. I actually think there's no way of moving outside of the biases that you generally adopt as you're maturing and growing. But there is a way to stop yourself and consider beyond your bias, to start to um, make your biases, to eliminate the stronghold I think that our biases have over us. Um, and I think part of that is humility. I think with empathy comes incredible humility. And I also think with empathy comes this idea of just advancement. And so I do think, Brene Brown has such a powerful platform for the work that she's doing. And I think so much of that started with this idea of vulnerability and courage. And out of that came this idea of empathy as a part of that kind of that soup, so to speak. And I would say that I agree that without vulnerability, without empathy, there isn't a lot of hope for us as human beings. All of that requires courage. And so to be empathetic is to be courageous, but it's also, so kind of to your point about empathy fatigue, there's a psychologist that I watched that I think summed it up much better than I could have, or that I can even now. And she sits with people who have great depression. So these are kind of the most depressed, the most challenged by the anxieties and pain of the world. And what she said, how she moves through this and can do this work every day as an empath herself, is she says, I allow myself to sit with people's pain. So I allow them to give it to me when they're in front of me. When we sit together, I allow them to give me their pain. I allow them to share their anxiety and their depression with me. And I sit with them in that space. And then when they leave, I give it back to them. Because I can't solve it for them. That's the work that they have to do. And I thought it was really powerful because I think empathy fatigue only gets tiring if you hold it to yourself. And I think that ultimately the whole point of empathy is to recognize that you can't change people's situations. And so feeling with them doesn't mean that all of a sudden their burdens become your burdens. But it does mean that I can, like Jesus, walk with you through that period, through that pain, through that trauma, or just through that experience, whatever that experience is that you're having. And because I can, whether it's virtually, physically, or even just emotionally, walk with you or feel with you in that moment, I also know that it's not my burden to hold on to. But I can do something to help change your experience. And that's my job. That's the work that I get to do. And so I think it's more of a hopeful, if you see it from that perspective, empathy is hopeful because I get to be a part of changing somebody else's life, not just my own.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, but also a lot of hope to be had in that process. Is there anything that we lose when we adopt empathy?
Sure, there's a lot that we lose. We certainly lose selfishness. The world has to stop being just about ourselves. I think ultimately that's the only thing that you really lose is the it's all about me perspective. Even the it's all about us when we're talking about an us that is our tribe or those we've come to call our neighbors. We lose that because it has to stop being just about us. But I think there's so much more that is gained than is ever lost because by creating a future that benefits others beyond our neighbors, that tries to benefit the collective as much as that is possible, I think we actually gain the future that we're actually seeking to create. We also, I think, in some ways have to give up the hubris that we all seem to have about our own perspectives, that the way I see it must therefore be right. And again, that it takes humility to recognize that. I think we're all in this journey, and I would hope that we would all be able to admit that we're in this journey called life, not to walk away from it feeling like we have all the answers. But I think part of the beauty of life is just continuing to ask more questions. And so I think that's what we gain is an ability to see the fullness of the world. I often talk about this idea of lens, and Ideos actually is built on this idea of the lens effect, that we all can be looking at the same image simultaneously. And imagine that everyone has a camera and is pointing their lens at this image. Depending on how we all bias our lenses, so how we actually set the settings for our lens, how much light we let in, the aperture, the depth, the detail, are we blurring the background, are we blurring the foreground? All of those tools that photographers have, everyone's picture is going to be different. No one's picture is going to be the same because we all have a very biased lens that is biased differently and uniquely. Mm. And so all of those images are correct. None of them are inherently wrong. It's just we see it differently. Mm. And oftentimes it isn't until all of those images are blended together, that the images themselves are kind of interwoven, that we actually see the fullness of what actually is before us. And I think that's the same with this work that we've been called empathy. Empathy allows us not to be satisfied with just the image that we create and that we see through our own lens, but it's desiring to see it through others, to add their perspectives and their lenses and the images that they create to our own, so that we can start to see fullness and wholeness in a way that I don't think we could do individually.
Yeah. You talk some about sacrifice, the humility that it takes, and how Jesus gives us the ability to do that and to walk with one another. And it sounds like this is a particularly Christian call. Can you tell us more about what the role Christians have in this conversation is?
Yes. Well, I think as Christians, and I think people of faith in general, but certainly from a biblical perspective, Christians have been called to love your neighbor. I mean, one of the greatest principles that we have as Christians, and the greatest calls that we have on our life when we become Christians, is to love your neighbor as yourself. We could, I think the church in many ways could spend a lifetime just trying to figure out what that means, to love somebody as yourself. But I think it really is the foundation of empathy. It's the foundation of what we're doing. Because to love somebody as yourself means I want your life to mean as much and to benefit as much from the world that we live in and the tangible things that we have access to. I want it as much for you as I want it for myself. It's kind of like thinking about the stranger among us. I want their life to be as full as my own children's lives. And so working towards that, I think, takes a lifetime. And so I do think in many ways it's a uniquely Christian call from that perspective, because it is an actual calling on our life. It is the foundation for the Christian walk. I also think, though, the idea of sacrifice often comes from a very spiritual, certainly biblical perspective and place. Because, and I will put it in a way that Andy Crouch, who author and incredible speaker and Christian, I would say kind of culture guru, has said at a conference that I listened to him speak at. And he said, there is this third way called sacrifice. In the idea of game theory, which so many of us play every day in every decision we make, there's usually two outcomes. It's the I win, you lose, or somehow I win, you win. We each win a little less. And I think what Andy was really bringing to light is that that's not it. We don't have binary choices between those two options. There's a third way in game theory, and that it's I sacrifice, we win. And I've just so loved that, even that imagery that creates is what would it look like if everyone sacrificed enough to let all of us win, to let everyone win. Mm. What would that community, what would that society look like if we all lived that way? And so while I do think it is certainly an important call on the Christian life and on the Christian walk, I think it is inherently the call that we all have as human beings. Mm-hmm. My hope is that in each of us, there's an innate desire to want the better for somebody else. But yeah, I do think that as Christians, because that is really the Great Commission, it is in some ways a uniquely Christian expression, I think, of Christ's love for us.
Yeah. But in that, even, it sounds like the end is not just for this insular Christian experience. Can you speak more to that?
Sure. I think we have been called to impact the world, to bring, Christ's love, mercy, and grace to the world, not just to ourselves. And I think, how else can we express God's love for us and the world if we're not living that out every day? And so it isn't insular for just the Christian community and just for the church. It really is for humanity as a whole, because our work is to love others. Our call is to love others. And that that overcomes boundaries, the artificial boundaries that have been created by man, not by God. And so I do think, even when you think about what would it be like even for my Christian brother or sister in another country, what is their life like? How is it vastly different from my own? Mm-hmm. Well, that's hard enough to imagine, much less think about what is it like just for an average person who's experiencing a life very different from my own. Mm-hmm. And how can I, in my little sphere of influence, how can I do something to make it better? And usually that means sacrifice. It means sacrificing a little of what I have so somebody else can have more. And in some ways, that's not a traditionally American principle. I think we think of capitalism as more for me. I think the great thing about empathy versus capitalism, and it is in capitalism, there's a limited supply of resources. And so the more I have, unfortunately, the less somebody else has. The great thing about empathy is it's limitless. And so I can have as much empathy as I need and give almost all of it away and never be emptied up at myself. It's a generative. It's generative. But empathy is generative. The more I give away, the more I think I get back. And so I do think that it's something that is meant for the world. It's beneficial for the world. And to be honest, it's really not that hard to do.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Can you tell me more of your story and how you were drawn to this work?
Sure. It's an interesting story, probably a little bit of a unique story, but kind of mid-career, about 10 years ago, I made a career change that took me kind of out of the corporate world and brought me into this world of foreign policy, national security, but more specifically into the world of religious freedom and religious freedom as kind of and its connection to conflict. And it wasn't a path that I chose. It was kind of an of the moment experience, because it was at a time where terrorism was exploding around the world. Nations were trying to figure out, how do we deal with religious conflict around the world? And those of us that were working on issues of international religious freedom recognized that there was a direct connection between the suppression of religious freedom and the increase in conflict. And so as I was working kind of in this conflict space, I recognized that there was something missing. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew that there was something missing, that we were still having too many conversations about policies. We were still having too many conversations that kind of rotated around this game theory idea of, either we win, they lose, or if we both win, we have to win a little bit less. I also recognized in working with religious communities all over the world that to ask them to moderate their belief systems was a non-starter. In fact, it was an insult to even assume that they could moderate their beliefs. Unlike America and parts of the West, in most of the world, there isn't a separation between church and state. Church is the way they see state. It's the way they live out their civic duties. It is their civil society. It's the way their institutions are built. It's the way their families are built. Everything is built around their religious practices and beliefs. And so to go in and ask them to believe that a little bit less in order to achieve some semblance of peace was just an insult to them. It was disrespectful. And I there was a moment where I said, I get it. Because basically what I'm asking you to do is, in order for there to be peace, you have to believe and see the world a little bit more like I do. It goes back to this idea of selfishness, that the world needs to look a little bit more like I want it to look in order for there to be peace. And I think when I walked away from that work, the question that I was left with was, how do we create a peaceful world where we can both believe differently? And I don't know that I've come to that answer, but I certainly know that empathy has a lot to do with it. Empathy takes us a step closer to the answer, to the solution to that question. Because I think that the more we recognize that the most of what we see, believe, and think, we actually have in common. And it's a far less amount that we disagree on. But often the pieces we disagree on are the catalysts for conflict. But I think if we have empathy, those differences lose some of their power. In fact, I think it loses a lot of its power. Because to empathize means to desire better for you too. And I think if we move into solutions with that mindset, that yes, I want it better for me, but I also want it better for you. Then the question is, how do we get there? Not how do we fight which one of us gets it.
Yeah. I think I've had the privilege of seeing your solutions of bringing empathy into conflict transformation and bringing those solutions to the table. And one of them being food for thought. So I want to circle back around to that and what you mentioned earlier. So can you tell us more about what food for thought is and how it contributes to the empathy table?
Sure. So food for thought really was obviously a conversation you and I were having. I want to give an incredible amount of credit to you because food for thought was really your brainchild in large part. And I think that where we were in this moment where kind of COVID-19 moved from Asia and swept across the world was this moment where I think we both realized that the past and the way we were living in the past was woefully inefficient for the future that was to come. And how do we see that future was, I think, the question we were trying to solve. How did the empathy table become a platform for seeding that future? And so, this idea of food for thought being this moment of co-creation, of seeding a future, also gave us this idea of nourishment, because obviously seeding something, if nourished well, produces life. It produces a product, nourishment. So it was this idea of how do we really provide that spiritual nourishment? I think right now, not just to a country, but to a world that is anxious, that is scared, certainly fearful of what's to come, and in deep pain, experiencing deep pain and loss in this moment. And I think both of us decided we needed to do something to shine a little bit of light into these dark spaces, to provide people with a little bit of hope. but also to start co-creating that future together. And so bringing people again around that table, not necessarily to deal with the challenges that we only a month ago were arguing and debating about, but to really think about a future worth having and a future worth creating together. And so it's this idea of bringing voices into conversation together that can help plant those seeds. But it really will be up to the rest of us to nourish and ensure that that ground is fertile. Otherwise, this idea, this platform, this program, this podcast will have little traction. And so in some ways it's our gift to the world, but it's a gift that they actually have to take, unwrap, and actually do something with.
Yeah. So can you tell me more about the ways that empathy is an essential seed to plant now, specifically during the COVID-19 crisis, for a future, post-coronavirus?
Yeah, that future worth having. I think when you think of empathy, so I'm going to get a little scientific and wonky right now, and so I apologize, but there's so much research that's been done on how empathy is a critical aspect of critical thinking. It's integral to critical thinking, and critical thinking is required for great decision making. And studies have been done that some of the best leaders, most effective leaders in history actually led with empathy. Empathy was a core leadership style. And because it was a core of their leadership style, the solution set that they considered was so much broader because they were considering things outside of just their own perspective. And so the decisions they made took into account more than just the minority. It really took into account, the fullest community that they could consider. And so when we think about what a future worth having looks like, it will require a very different way of thinking. And it will require decisions that are built on critical thinking, and critical thinking that is built on empathy. And so really empathy informs that decision-making process. It serves as the foundation for that decision-making process. And so anything worth having is going to require work, but I think a future worth having post-COVID will require all of us to think about how is my life and the future that I desire, what does that mean? And the decisions that will be made to move in that direction, how will that affect others? And hopefully what this seeds and what empathy seeds is, how do I bring them with me? How do I ensure that they come with me into that future? Not the future that I desire is fine when I leave others behind. And I think that's what we have to grapple with, not just as a nation, but globally. I think we have to all ask the question, is a future worth having, worth ensuring that we all go into that future together? And that's going to take work. It's going to take some hard work. It's going to take some really hard decisions. It's going to take some incredible sacrifice. And I think at the core of all of that rests empathy.
Yeah. So who are you looking for to be on this podcast?
Yeah, I think for food for thought, we are thinking about really deep thinkers. I mean, there are some incredible creators, artists, culture makers, influencers, people who are trying to envision a future who are themselves athletes or entertainers, pastors. They're advocates who are thinking about a different future. And so really bringing together those voices, incredibly rich and deep conversations, I think is going to be the seeds that are planted, and really powerful seeds. And we're going to be talking about some really important conversations and topics, which, thinking about in this moment, what does education look like?
Mm-hmm.
And how might education be different post-COVID? We're going to be talking about what flourishing means in post-COVID environment. And we'll think about how technology and artificial intelligence plays a role in that future. And can it actually promote empathy as a part of that future making? We're going to be talking about healthcare and what healthcare might look like in the future, what equity looks like. How do we consider differently the least of these? And one podcast episode that I'm excited about that you will be leading is kind of what's a Gen Z response to a post-COVID future. Those of our society right now who are living through this and experiencing it in a really unique way are, seeing, graduations ending, who are seeing, the end of their senior year before it actually was supposed to happen, who have seen, a complete disruption to early careers. That will all take a toll on this younger generation very uniquely. Even to think about beyond that, an entire generation of students who are figuring out, how do I learn from home? How do I learn outside of a classroom environment? That's gonna create different thinking. And so I'm excited to think about what these conversations will be like, how they will begin to seed that future, and then how it basically sets the table for the rest of what we do as the empathy table.
Yeah. Wow, that's awesome. Exciting stuff.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to be doing it with you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Christy. There's a lot on the table. I'm excited to dig in, get the season started up. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for sharing our table today. Tune in next week for another feast of story, hope, and empathy. To stay connected with us throughout the week, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Empathy Table. For updates from your host, extras from guests, and previous episodes, head over to idiosinstitute.com/theempathytable. You can find the Empathy Table video podcast on YouTube and the Ideos website. Audio is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts. Like, subscribe, and share. And while we've set the table, it wouldn't be complete without you, our listeners. Email us at theempathytable@idiosinstitute.com with thoughts on the show or your stories of empathy and how it has impacted your life. Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week. We'll save you a seat.